proud of the Killingworth Women's Organization for putting this program together. It's required a lot of hard thought about some very ugly realities, but it is such an important topic for our town. In a place like this, where it's very easy to be isolated in the woods and to feel alone and vulnerable, we all have to be aware of the potential for domestic violence, to name it and to start to fight it. That's why I'm very heartened that almost all the organizations in town got together to support this. Together, we can really make sure that every corner of Killingworth is aware. I want to thank the KWO for supporting this program, and Andrea Freibauer she's the president, and she's really been a stalwart. She's also been on the Domestic Violence Awareness Committee, as have Jackie Bousquet, Eileen Cyrus, Donna Fornell, Mary Kay Fergola, Kelly Leach, Eileen Leahy, Teresa Yoka, and Suzanne Sack, who I will turn the program over to in a minute. But I especially want to thank Sandy Allard and Lynn Clark. Sandy was the chair, and Lynn the deputy chair, and it's been an inspiration working with them. So great thanks to them.
Now for the program tonight. Killingworth Aware is first and foremost a program about heightening awareness about domestic violence. And as a result of attending, you will know the signs and signals of domestic violence. You'll know more about the lessons learned, either by victims or by bystanders. And what that means is there are some do's and don'ts of what you should or shouldn't do if you find yourself a victim or a bystander of domestic violence. There are also myths and misconceptions, and they lead to misunderstanding the issue or the people involved. We'll also learn more about the resources available to victims and to families in crisis. We'll start with the program with a recorded presentation from the stage of TED Talks of a woman who is a survivor of domestic violence. After that, we'll follow with a live presentation from Shauna Cullen, a representative from New Horizons, which is a program of the Community Health Center. We'll then hear from our very own resident trooper, guess who he is, Matt Ward, and then from Justin Smith, a member of the Killingworth Lions and an attorney. Following will be another presentation from the stage of TED Talks, this time from Jackson Katz, who's an activist in fighting to prevent gender violence. And last, but not least, we'll have Ted Kennedy Jr., our state senator, here, and he'll join us and make a brief presentation. Yeah. As mentioned, our first presentation is a recorded TED Talk presentation of Leslie M. Steiner. She's a domestic violence survivor. She provides candid insights on how an ordinary person can find herself or himself in this situation, and why sometimes domestic violence victims don't leave. Let's watch and listen.
I'm here today to talk about a disturbing question, which has an equally disturbing answer. My topic is the secrets of domestic violence. And the question I'm going to tackle is the one question everyone always asks. Why does she stay? Why would anyone stay with a man who beats her? I'm not a psychiatrist, a social worker, or an expert in domestic violence. I'm just one woman with a story to tell. I was 22. I had just graduated from Harvard College. I'd moved to New York City for my first job as a writer and editor at 17 magazine. I had my first apartment, my first little green American Express card, and I had a very big secret. My secret was that I had this gun loaded with hollow point bullets pointed at my head by the man who I thought was my soulmate many, many times. The man who I loved more than anybody on earth held a gun to my head and threatened to kill me more times than I can even remember. I'm here to tell you the story of crazy love, a psychological trap disguised as love, one that millions of women and even a few men fall into every year. It may even be your story. I don't look like a typical domestic violence survivor. I have a BA in English from Harvard College, an MBA in marketing from Wharton Business School. I spent most of my career working for Fortune 500 companies, including Johnson & Johnson, Leo Burnett, and the Washington Post. I've been married for almost 20 years to my second husband, and we have 3 kids together. My dog is a black lab, and I drive a Honda Odyssey minivan. So my first message for you is that domestic violence happens to everyone. All races, all religions, all income and education levels. It's everywhere. And my second message is that everyone thinks domestic violence happens to women, that it's a women's issue. Not exactly. Over 85% of abusers are men. And domestic abuse happens only in intimate, interdependent, long-term relationships. In other words, in families. The last place we would want or expect to find violence, which is one reason domestic abuse is so confusing. I would have told you myself that I was the last person on earth who would stay with a man who beats me. But in fact, I was a very typical victim because of my age. I was 22. And in the United States, women ages 16 to 24 are 3 times as likely to be domestic violence victims as women of other ages. And over 500 women and girls this age are killed every year by abusive partners, boyfriends and husbands in the United States. I was also a very typical victim because I knew nothing about domestic violence, its warning signs or its patterns. I met Connor on a cold, rainy January night. He sat next to me on the New York City subway, and he started chatting me up. He told me 2 things. One was that he, too, had just graduated from an Ivy League school, and that he worked at a very impressive Wall Street bank. But what made the biggest impression on me that first meeting was that he was smart and funny, and he looked like a farm boy. He had these big cheeks, these big apple cheeks, and this wheat blonde hair, and he seemed so sweet. One of the smartest things Connor did from the very beginning was to create the illusion that I was the dominant partner in the relationship. He did this, especially at the beginning, by idolizing me. We started dating, and he loved everything about me. That I was smart, that I'd gone to Harvard, that I was passionate about helping teenage girls and my job. He wanted to know everything about my family and my childhood, my hopes and dreams. Connor believed in me as a writer and a woman in a way that no one else ever had. And he also created a magical atmosphere of trust between us by confessing his secret, which was that as a very young boy, starting at age 4, he had been savagely and repeatedly physically abused by his stepfather. And the abuse had gotten so bad that he had had to drop out of school in 8th grade, even though he was very smart. And he'd spent almost 20 years rebuilding his life, which is why that Ivy League degree and the Wall Street job and his bright, shiny future meant so much to him. If you had told me that this smart, funny, sensitive man who adored me would one day dictate whether or not I wore makeup, how short my skirts were, where I lived, what jobs I took, who my friends were, and where I spent Christmas, I would have laughed at you. Because there was not a hint of violence or control or anger in Connor at the beginning. I didn't know that the first stage in any domestic violence relationship is to seduce and charm the victim. I also didn't know that the second step is to isolate the victim. Now, Connor did not come home one day and announce, hey, all this Romeo and Juliet stuff has been great, but I need to move into the next phase where I isolate you and I abuse you. So I need to get you out of this apartment where the neighbors can hear you scream, and out of this city where you have friends and family and coworkers who can see the bruises. Instead, Connor came home one Friday evening, and he told me that he had quit his job that day, his dream job. And he said that he had quit his job because of me, because I had made him feel so safe and loved that he didn't need to prove himself on Wall Street anymore. And he just wanted to get out of the city and away from his abusive, dysfunctional family and move to a tiny town in New England where he could start his life over with me by his side. Now, the last thing I wanted to do was leave New York and my dream job. But I thought you made sacrifices for your soulmate. So I agreed, and I quit my job, and Connor and I left Manhattan together. I had no idea I was falling into crazy love, that I was walking headfirst into a carefully laid physical, financial, and psychological trap. The next step in the domestic violence pattern is to introduce the threat of violence and see how she reacts. And here's where those guns come in. As soon as we moved to New England, you know that place where Connor was supposed to feel so safe? He bought 3 guns. He kept one in the glove compartment of our car. He kept one under the pillows on our bed. And the third one he kept in his pocket at all times. And he said that he needed those guns because of the trauma he'd experienced as a young boy. He needed them to feel protected. But those guns were really a message for me. And even though he hadn't raised a hand to me, my life was already in grave danger every minute of every day. Connor first physically attacked me 5 days before our wedding. It was 7 a.m. I still had on my nightgown. I was working on my computer trying to finish a freelance writing assignment, and I got frustrated. And Connor used my anger as an excuse to put both of his hands around my neck and to squeeze so tightly that I could not breathe or scream. And he used the chokehold to hit my head repeatedly against the wall. 5 days later, the 10 bruises on my neck had just faded, and I put on my mother's wedding dress, and I married him. Despite what had happened, I was sure we were going to live happily ever after, because I loved him, and he loved me so much. And he was very, very sorry. He had just been really stressed out by the wedding and by becoming a family with me. It was an isolated incident, and he was never going to hurt me again. It happened twice more on the honeymoon. The first time, I was driving to find a secret beach, and I got lost. And he punched me in the side of my head so hard that the other side of my head repeatedly hit the driver's side window. And then a few days later, driving home from our honeymoon, he got frustrated by traffic, and he threw a cold Big Mac in my face. Connor proceeded to beat me once or twice a week for the next 2.5 years of our marriage. I was mistaken in thinking that I was unique and alone in this situation. 1 in 3 American women experiences domestic violence or stalking at some point in her life. And the CDC reports that 15 million children are abused every year. 15 million. So actually, I was in very good company. Back to my question. Why did I stay? The answer is easy. I didn't know he was abusing me. Even though he held those loaded guns to my head, pushed me downstairs, threatened to kill our dog, pulled the key out of the car ignition as I drove down the highway, poured coffee grinds on my head as I dressed for a job interview. I never once thought of myself as a battered wife. Instead, I was a very strong woman in love with a deeply troubled man, and I was the only person on earth who could help Connor face his demons. The other question everybody asks is, why doesn't she just leave? Why didn't I walk out? I could have left any time. To me, this is the saddest and most painful question that people ask, because we victims know something you usually don't. It's incredibly dangerous to leave an abuser, because the final step in the domestic violence pattern is kill her. Over 70% of domestic violence murders happen after the victim has ended the relationship, after she's gotten out, because then the abuser has nothing left to lose. Other outcomes include long-term stalking, even after the abuser remarries, denial of financial resources, and manipulation of the family court system to terrify the victim and her children, who are regularly forced by family court judges to spend unsupervised time with the man who beat their mother. And still we ask, why doesn't she just leave? I was able to leave because of one final sadistic beating that broke through my denial. I realized that the man who I loved so much was going to kill me if I let him. So I broke the silence. I told everyone. The police, my neighbors, my friends and family, total strangers. And I'm here today because you all helped me. We tend to stereotype victims as grisly headlines, self-destructive women, damaged goods. The question, why does she stay, is code for some people for it's her fault for staying, as if victims intentionally choose to fall in love with men intent upon destroying us. But since publishing Crazy Love, I have heard hundreds of stories from men and women who also got out, who learned an invaluable life lesson from what happened, and who rebuilt lives, joyous, happy lives, as employees, wives, and mothers, lives completely free of violence. Like me, because it turns out that I'm actually a very typical domestic violence victim and a typical domestic violence survivor. I remarried a kind and gentle man. We have those 3 kids. I have that black lab, and I have that minivan. What I will never have again, ever, is a loaded gun held to my head by someone who says that he loves me. Now, right now, maybe you're thinking, wow, this is fascinating. Or, wow, how stupid was she? But this whole time, I've actually been talking about you. I promise you, there are several people listening to me right now who are currently being abused, or who were abused as children, or who are abusers themselves. Abuse could be affecting your daughter, your sister, your best friend right now. I was able to end my own crazy love story by breaking the silence. I'm still breaking the silence today. It's my way of helping other victims. And it's my final request of you. Talk about what you heard here. Abuse thrives only in silence. You have the power to end domestic violence simply by shining a spotlight on it. We victims need everyone. We need every one of you to understand the secrets of domestic violence. Show abuse the light of day by talking about it with your children, your coworkers, your friends and family. Recast survivors as wonderful, lovable people with full futures. Recognize the early signs of violence and conscientiously intervene, de-escalate it, show victims a safe way out. Together, we can make our beds, our dinner tables, and our families the safe and peaceful oases they should be. Thank you.
As Leslie mentioned, domestic violence can take on many forms and happen to anyone. She pleads with her audience, us, to shed light on domestic violence and to not stay silent. But who do you call and who do you talk to? Who can you trust, and how do you maintain confidence and know that you'll be safe? Our next speaker, Shauna Cullen from New Horizons, the Middlesex County Resource for Community Outreach, Hotline and Shelter Services, Children's Programs, and Advocacy for Victims, can provide a few answers for us to those questions. Shauna, thanks for being here.
So what is domestic violence? Domestic violence is a pattern of coercive, controlling behavior that can include physical, emotional, financial, psychological abuse. And, that's not to say that if somebody comes up and hits you, yes, that is abuse, but typically this is a pattern that we see, and I'll definitely go into that once we get the PowerPoint up. Who does domestic violence affect? Take a look to your left, take a look to your right. Everybody. There's not a single person that domestic violence doesn't affect. It doesn't matter your gender, it doesn't matter your sexual orientation, it doesn't matter what religious group you're a part of, it affects everyone. So a little bit about the cycle of abuse. So we talked about domestic violence being a pattern of behavior. The pattern of behavior that we typically see is when, you're with your intimate partner, whether it be man, woman, woman, man, however the configuration, there's going to be some tension building. There could be a verbal argument, there could be shoving, there could be somebody, not giving over some finances because somebody else needs to go grocery shopping. And then there's an incident. When an incident happens, which could be the verbal, emotional, physical, anger, blaming types of behaviors that we see, that's the next phase in the cycle. Moving on, there's reconciliation. Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it, I'll do better, I'll change. And I think that's something a lot of our survivors believe, that their abuser will change. And unfortunately, most of the time, that doesn't happen. Afterwards, the reconciliation, there's a calm phase, the honeymoon phase, everything's good, everyone's happy, nobody's arguing. And then it just goes back to this tension, and the cycle repeats itself. So I kind of wanted to talk about more specifics in regards to what constitutes domestic violence as far as the physical, emotional, financial. I'll give you a few examples of those. Physical would be scratching, hitting, biting, choking, pushing, shoving, anything of that nature. It's just unacceptable. We also have emotional, psychological. This is huge. We see this in, I would say, all of our victims that call. It's really, a lot of the reason that they do call us is because they're tired of the emotional and the psychological abuse that they're suffering. So this can include name-calling, intimidation, yelling, manipulation, making it difficult for you to see friends, the isolation, as we saw in the TED Talks previously. Economical is also huge. Maybe this, in a situation where one of the couples stays at home with the kids and the other person is working, and although, they're married and it's the family's money, the other person still has to ask for money to go grocery shopping or to get the kids shoes or school supplies. We also see a lot of stalking and harassment, especially now with social media. A lot of our victims are coming to us, oh, so-and-so went on my Facebook page, posted, inappropriate pictures of me, or, changed my password, I can't get back on my social media, they took my phone, I can't get back in it, I can't call anybody. As well as sexual abuse, which is also huge, and this is any unwanted contact from your partner. All of these factors are going to lead to health problems for our victims. I can kind of just go over, the physical issues, bruising, cuts on the face, gastrointestinal issues from stress, sexual and reproductive issues, unwanted pregnancies, unsafe abortion, tampering with birth control. Mental things can come up as well. A lot of our victims who come into shelter or speak to us on the hotline, they have depression or anxiety because of the state and what they're going through. And behavioral as well. You know, when we're in that fight or flight mode, we might make some poor choices, which, you know, could be harmful or risky. A little bit about our children who witness domestic violence or who unfortunately are a part of domestic violence. The biggest part about the children, what I want you to understand is they see what's going on. There was a survey done, I believe 90% of children knew that what was going on was not normal and it was not okay. So they see what's going on, and unfortunately, if intervention does not happen, they're going to repeat the cycle. A little bit about red flags, things maybe you can look for in somebody who you might think could be in a bad relationship. You know, does their partner stalk or harass them? Are their mood swings unpredictable? Things like that. Are they trying to isolate them from family? You know, what's their reasoning? You know, they can't come to the family picnic. It doesn't make any sense. They minimize their negative behavior, which is a part of the manipulation. You're crazy, you're crazy, you're crazy. A lot of our victims tell us this is something they hear because their abuser is trying to make them feel like what they're going through is normal and it is acceptable, and it's not. I have some really great statistics on domestic violence, and they're a little shocking, frankly, but I think it's important to kind of put that out there. It takes an average of 5 to 7 times for a person to leave their abusive relationship. Again, it's because of this cycle of the tension building, an incident happening, reconciliation, everybody's happy, I'll change. And then an incident comes again. It's really up to the person how much they're going to tolerate of this abuse. And every person has a different threshold. And that is a lot of the reason why our victims stay. I think this is something that was mentioned in the TED Talks, but 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have been victims of some form of physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. So again, let's look around the room. 1 out of 3 and 1 out of 4 is pretty shocking. That's about 25%, 30% of people. So chances are, a third of the room has experienced intimate partner violence. And just a new area that's being explored in the field of domestic violence is of the LGBTQ community, where rates occur at about the same, but bisexual women have an alarmingly higher rate of domestic violence. So how can you help? Or how can you get help? Well, you can certainly call us. We have the statewide hotline available, and if you're from a different area of the state, we also have the New Horizons number available. I was going through our statistics, and it appears here that from September 1st, 2014 to September 1st, 2015, 13 people from your town called us and asked for help. Now, I know that's not a huge number, but those are just the people who sought help. There are a lot of people who did not seek help. And that's where I kind of leave it up to you to reach out to those people, you know, kind of tap them on the shoulder. Does this seem normal to you? What are you going through? Do you need help? You want me to call the hotline with you? Any sort of thing, that would be fabulous. So again, what was mentioned in the TED Talks, the most dangerous time for a person is when they are leaving the relationship or when they serve their partner with a restraining order. This is because the abuser is losing control of this person, and they are more likely to act more severely than they have before. And it's a very scary time, and that's why I ask you that if you know somebody who wants to leave, needs to file a restraining order, please call us. You know, this is something we do 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. We can really help you. And if your friend doesn't want to call because they're afraid, you can call us and just let them know you're calling on behalf of a friend and you're concerned. We're more than happy to safety plan with you as well. That being said, we also do offer support groups here. We offer the HEART, Helping End Abusive Relationship Tendencies. We have that for adults as well as for children, and they are run at the same time at the Family Wellness Center in Middletown. We are we're trying very hard to get a group going in Clinton. I know that would be more convenient to those who live down this way and on the shoreline. And anyone can attend that. We have had male victims attend, and it's been perfectly fine. It's worked out really well, so we don't discourage any, exclusion of anybody. We'll take anyone, and if they don't speak English, we have a language line, or we can provide them with an interpreter. So we're trying to eliminate the barriers to get services to people. We do have a family violence victim advocate in the Middletown court who deals with our criminal cases. Unfortunately, we do not have a civil court advocate. However, our criminal court advocate, if she has time, she can assist people with restraining orders. However, if she is too busy, call the hotline. Any of our advocates can also assist with that. And I have a PSA, but I don't think it's going to play. So I'd like to open up the floor for any questions. If you have, maybe you know somebody who's in a specific situation, you were thinking of them, or you have a question about court or how things are handled when somebody calls the hotline, please feel free to ask us.
You didn't really touch on the role of judges and their general ignorance about all of this. And I'm from Middletown, and we just had that little boy thrown off the bridge because the initial attempt to get restraining order, which in my opinion are completely worthless, because somebody that's an abuser is not going to follow a restraining order. But she couldn't get it because the judge didn't believe her. She was too afraid to be very detailed and frank in her concerns. And he just said, well, you're young, we're not in a relationship, just be cool with her. So when a person runs into a court judge, even if they decide to bring a criminal complaint, he hit me, he choked me, he threatened me, what can we do?
So I'll kind of sum up the question as, what are we doing to help the judges understand domestic violence? Does that sound kind of where you're going at?
Yeah, a little more than help.
Sure. So we are working with the Middletown Court to provide in-depth training about domestic violence, kind of like an in her shoes, in his shoes kind of overview of what victims go through. It definitely is an issue that we've been pressing. We've held one training so far. Hopefully we'll be invited for more. We do offer our services to them on a regular basis, and we do get invited from time to time. So certainly that is something we are working towards. Yes?
What about if you're afraid to leave a pet with the abuser?
Sure. So, unfortunately, our shelters are facilities, and we can't allow pets unless they're therapy animals. So we do work with a program called Companions in Crisis, and we call them and let them know we have a pet, we let them know what breed, and they find a foster situation should that person enter shelter, or even if, we had a woman call, she had to go live with her mother in a retirement community where animals were not allowed. So we would be able to find a foster home for those animals. Unfortunately, during the fostering time, the person can't visit the animal, but they, do take comfort in knowing that they're safe. Yes?
Other than calling the hotline, if your friend or neighbor is not ready for that, what are some suggestions that you could give us to help someone in need that's not ready for that step? Like, as a neighbor, friend, or coworker, what can you do other than talking about it to be there and support them?
Sure. So it would definitely depend on the situation and your comfort level and your safety. If this is somebody who you just met, I would tread lightly and just let them know you're a source of support. One of the biggest things is to not be judgmental. A lot of the time we give people advice based on what we would do, and that's not the way to go about it. We want to make sure that we're giving them the opportunity to let us know how their abuser works and how we can help them. And a lot of the times, you know, they have tried to leave before, so they might tell you that. And you kind of just want to be supportive, non-judgmental, and let them know they're not alone and that there is help. So I would certainly encourage them to call us. I know a lot of people are just not comfortable with that. It's not safe for them. They're afraid their abuser might be tracking their phone. And, you know, in cases like that, there's always ways to get a hold of us. Yes?
We also should talk about people who, with the best of intentions, with a friend, might say, well, you can come and stay with me. Just leave during the day and use it, pack up and come here. Well, that puts that person in danger as well. So that's another dilemma.
Sure.
Trying to reach out.
Right, so a lot of the times, we might take on, we might bite off a little more than we can chew. So if you're offering your space to somebody, you need to consider, is it safe? A neighbor's house? Probably not, long term. Sure, it depends on how much room. The thing is, housing in Connecticut is really hard to get. So if this person's a stay-at-home mom and they don't have a job, they're gonna have to work for a few months to save up a little bit of money for rent. And that's, you know, just for rent, you have to consider how many kids they have, how many mouths to feed, utilities, things like that. So you gotta be careful what you're offering to people, and if you can't offer it, call us, and, you know, we can help you sort those types of things out. Unfortunately, I don't have any more time for questions tonight, but please feel free to grab one of our brochures in the back. I would be more than happy to talk to you. If I'm not available, we are staffed 24 hours, 365 days a year. You will get an adult advocate to speak to that is trained in domestic violence. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Shauna. As Shauna mentioned, New Horizons covers all of Middlesex County. It's available 365 days a year. Our very own resident trooper, Matt Ward, is here to discuss what's happening right here in Killingworth and what the state police do when they're responding to a call regarding domestic violence. Matt?
For those who don't know me, I'm Matt Ward. I'm the resident trooper in Killingworth. I've been a trooper for almost 16 years, and this month I'm starting my 10th year in Killingworth. But like the video said, and like Shauna said before, domestic violence occurs all across the world every day. It doesn't discriminate against anybody. In my 16 years as a trooper, I've investigated my fair share of domestic violence incidents in town, out of town, across the area that I cover. It's one of the most volatile calls for us to go to. Anytime we get a call for a domestic violence type incident, we send 2 people minimum, just for our safety and safety of people with us. We've had plenty of incidents where we go to a domestic violence call and we, going to make an arrest, and the person that we're going to arrest, we go try to handcuff them, and the person who's the victim. And one time where the victim jumped on the other trooper's back as they're trying to arrest the guy. Why are you taking him away? So it's one of those situations they talk about the cycle. They called for help, we came to help them, and then they like, well, now they see things flashing in front of them, and they panic. Connecticut does have some of the strictest domestic violence laws, though, and over my 16-year career, they have progressively changed for the police and as well as the victims, and I think it's for the better. Some of the newest changes, in the past, you go to a domestic call, and they may say, okay, you go stay here tonight, you go stay here tonight, you come back and get arrested. That's how it used to be back in the old days. And unfortunately, some stuff has happened throughout the country, and even in Connecticut, when new laws were passed, people got hurt, and we needed to protect ourselves and protect the victims more. So they came up with some new laws. Some of the trainings that we've gone to now, they're trying to train us to attempt to determine who the main aggressor is in the incident, instead of doing dual arrests and let the courts figure it out. That has happened in the past. You both get arrested, we've been here too many times, let the courts figure it out. we're trying to take a step back from that and really find out who the main aggressor of the incident is and determine if there's enough probable cause in that incident to make an arrest. Not all calls we go to require an arrest. Sometimes people have very difficult arguments. Sometimes people may break their own property. You know, they yell and scream, say things they don't mean. So unfortunately, it's one of the most volatile situations, and there's three sides to every story when we go to the public. Sometimes we even have to ask the children, what did you see, what did you hear, away from the parents, because they get stuck in the middle. And I have 5 children at home. I don't want them to ever witness that. And I miss telling my kids. Thank you very much. So some of the new situations is that we have victims' rights cards and now we give the victims with numbers for Shauna and different programs out there for people to help protect them. When we go to an incident where we believe an arrest is going to be made, we sit down with the victim, we come up with a short-term and a long-term safety plan. Okay, what are you going to do for the next 24 hours? Where are you going to go? What's your long-term plan? So we actually sit down with them and go over this, and we document it in our report. It's part of our requirements now, which I think is a great asset to have, because we can document, this is what she said she was going to do, this is what we decided to do, call a friend, a neighbor, something to try to help this victim out. Another thing that's really important, a lot of people are afraid to call because of criminal news releases. Unfortunately, a lot of information out there is public information, especially for the police. They have our scanners, they have our radios. All right, sometimes we get called to a call, and they're calling us, asking us what they call, we haven't even got there yet. All right, so when someone is an arrest, we have, by law, Public Information Act, we have to document that arrest. And a criminal news release at the barracks that's available for public to view. Part of these new laws that they recently passed is the redaction of the criminal news release. So, and I spoke to my sergeant before I came just to confirm that, and he basically told me he's in charge of redacting the news release. Anything that can or will lead back to the victim is redacted. Addresses, last names, first names. It's very generic, very basic. We want to protect the victim, you know, and help them know that they called and it's not everyone's business. Even though it's important for other people to know what happened, but it's not necessarily something that posted in the paper.
What about the victim,
It depends on, if he's been arrested, it depends on the situation. You might have first and last name, but that's up to the supervisor at the time. But anything that can tie back to the victim, we're going to redact it for safety reasons as well. One of the new things which also falls into with Shauna is it's called a LAP assessment. It's a domestic violence lethality screening for first responders. Obviously, I'm a first responder, so it's this new form that the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence created. We've been trained on how to use it. So when we go to a call where we believe that either arrest has been made, or just we're not, like I said, not every call the arrest is made, and some calls we will go and document. It just wasn't enough for an arrest, I want to document it and a paper trail. So everything's in our computer, so we can see if we've been back to the house before. We have special alerts for an address if we know there's problems in our past, and protective orders, restraining orders. Those are all questions that when we receive the call, the dispatcher or trooper desk will ask. Is there any protective orders, restraining orders, any weapons in the house? We'll do weapons checks on both parties in our database. So we have as much information going in the call as we can for our safety and their safety as well. So part of this form, we initiate it. I'll just read you a little bit of the form just to kind of get an idea of what type of questions we're going to ask the victim. When do we initiate this assessment? It's when an intimate relationship is involved, and you believe an assault has occurred, you sense the potential for danger is high, the names of the party and locations are repeat, we've been there before, or you simply believe one should be done. I have 10 years I've been here, I have pretty good personal knowledge of a lot of people in this town, and I can know stuff that happened 5, 6 years ago, 10 years ago, or even when I was on the road before, the 6 years prior to that. So we fill it out. We advise them, we ask them a few questions. The first 3 questions are what triggers the initial protocol referral. The first question is, has he or she ever used a weapon against you or threatened you with a weapon? You can answer yes, no, or not answer at all. Number 2, he or she is threatened to kill you or your children. Number 3, do you think he or she might try to kill you? A yes response to any of these 1 to 3 questions triggers an automatic referral. If they answer no to those questions, then we have another 11 questions that we ask. So we would still continue with them after we did the first 3. And just go over real quick, just so you kind of get an idea of what we're looking for. And as a victim, if you're a victim, you know what questions you're going to be asked, because it's important to know. And a lot of, like I said before, people are in denial. They don't want to admit this is done. Does he or she have a gun, or he or she can get one easily? Does he or she ever try to choke you? Is he or she violently or constantly jealous? Or does he or she control most of your daily activities? Have you left him or her sexually after living together or being married? Is he or she unemployed? Has he or she ever tried to kill himself or herself? Do you have a child that he or she knows is not his or hers? And does he or she follow or spy on you or leave threatening messages? Out of those questions, they only have to have a yes to at least 4. And that triggers a protocol referral, automatic. And then we ask another question, is there anything else that worries you about your safety that's not covered in here? No, they're not. But that could be another thing, say, hey, he or she threatened to harm our pets. Yeah, or did harm, correct. So if they fit the protocol, we would use our cell phone to call the hotline. On the back of the form, there's different hotlines for different towns, so we find the appropriate one, and Shauna's New Horizons would be the one we would call. We would call them on our phone because we don't want to call on their phone, because if their abuser is checking their phone, they're going to say, oh, who'd you call? So we want to try to protect them, or block the number, or do something to, because that does happen to people, they check their phones and messages and stuff like that. So we'll call the hotline, we'll speak to the person, we'll tell them about our assessment, what they answered yes or no to, and then we'll advise them that we refer you to a domestic violence hotline, and we ask the victim to speak to the person right then and there. They can refuse, and I asked Shauna before she had to leave a couple of questions about it, because we don't always necessarily know what happens after they and just confirm a couple of things with her. But we had them talk to the counsel right then and there. And she said if they refuse to talk, which has happened, we'll try to get them a safe contact number. And then Shauna says their hotline will try to make 3 attempts to contact them. After the 3 attempts, unfortunately, they stop. She says and they would stop calling them if the person says stop calling them. Unfortunately, it works, but if they don't want the help, it's hard to get it filled out. So, say the person said no to all these questions, and I have personal knowledge that I feel this is not a safe situation, I can make an automatic referral. So it's not just discretion, it's based on my training experience, my personal knowledge of the incident, or prior knowledge from the people involved. So I think the way we've gone and the direction we're going is great for people. Yes, it's more paperwork for us, but in the end, it's for their safety. And change with the times, which I think is great for for people who need to get the help. I just want to give you some statistics of the town, just go through real quick. In 2010, we had 25 domestic-related calls. And again, I'm just going off the data. Sometimes it's all data entry, so if someone codes something wrong, I can't necessarily know exactly what it was for. But out of the 25 domestic-related calls, 20 of them were clear with no report. So it wasn't enough to make an arrest or enough probable cause to feel that someone was assaulted or injured, or it met the level of arrest. 5 were where a report was written, so there was an arrest made, or the incident was documented for some reason. So an arrest made or documented. 2011, we had 27 domestic-related incidents. In that year, 19 were arrests made, so a report written, and 8 no reports. I mean, it's still documented in the computer, but there's no report, no report, and no arrest made. 2012, we had 21 domestic-related incidents, 10 report written no arrests, and 11 cleared out as no reports. 2013, we had 11 domestic-related incidents, 3 report writtens, and 8 no reports. This past year, in 2014, we had a total of 11 domestic-related calls, 7 where reports were written, arrests made, and 4 no reports. And just through this year, as of through September of this year, we had a total of 8 domestic-related calls, where 6 reports were written and 2 no reports. So, like she said in the video, like I said before, we can't help if we don't know. So you have the hotline, you have the victim's right cards. There's plenty of avenues out there if you know someone's being abused. And even if we get called and we don't make an arrest, it's documented. That address is documented. What happened that day is documented. There's a paper trail. And we can see there's a pattern. And that helps us in the future. I go to a call that went on 123 Main Street. On my computer, it pops up how many times we've been to that address, and who was there, and what was happening. So it's important for people to know who's a victim of domestic violence. Because she said, what, 5 to 7 times before they're going to leave? So, and how many times did it happen before that until we get called? So it's just important to make those calls and help out someone who needs help. I can take some questions.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just went to the state.
Okay.
I know the laws vary from state to state. So if you go to a domestic violence call, what is kind of standing does the state have to prosecute independent of the victim actually pressing charges? Let's say if you go to a scene and you witness something, or you're able to gather enough evidence, can the state prosecute without the victim pressing charges?
Good question.
Thank you.
I'm going to refer that question to Justin. He is the attorney, and unfortunately, after we make the arrest, and it goes to court, it's kind of out of our hands. I have heard cases where the victim is an uncooperative victim, but I don't want to misspeak. Justin deals with that, so I'll let him speak when he comes up for that. Any other questions?
So you said that if multiple calls are made from a particular home, it would be regardless of what those calls were made for? So
Correct.
If it was a suicide attempt, if it was domestic
Yes.
violence, it would just come up that that address has made a shooting call?
Correct. Medical calls, alarms, anything like that, patrol check. And we can also set our computer system to alerts, like a frequent address when we have trouble with people, like we'll automatically send 2 guys, So we have the capability of tracking things and knowing what we've been there since we've been tracking it. Anybody else? Okay.
If there's any evidence about the effectiveness of the app screening?
I do not. It just started this year, so it's all new, and people are still getting trained in it. But from my standpoint, some people might complain that it's work, but in the end, it helps the victim, I think. So I think it's a great tool, and I think in this day and age, we have to document it. We have to help people. We have to walk people plan. They're not going to get help they need. Well, I appreciate it.
If a victim is willing to call the hotline with you and set up a safe plan, do you then wait with them until someone can come pick them up, or do you help escort them to the friend's house, or how
Yeah.
does that set up?
Every situation is different, but we will do what we have to do to get them where they need to go. If we know they're leaving, we'll help them leave. We also have situations where when we do have an arrest, and Justin can speak on this a little more, if there's an arrest made, automatic protective order is issued. So if that person is going to get out that night, like we set a bond, and we post the bond, there's a temporary protective order issued until they go to court. And all domestic violence cases go to court the next available day. So if you get arrested on Monday, you're going to court Tuesday. So then the court will issue a permanent protective order until the case is resolved. And we have the capability, or our supervisor has the capability of putting restrictions, but you can't go back there until they go to court, which will be the next day. So we will work with them and try to get them where they need to go. But, and then most times our protocol is if the person is going to get out, we give the victim a courtesy to say, hey, let's guess, this is what his bond was, and he's posting it. So We need to reassess our safety plan. That's what we try to do. And at least give them the courtesy and the heads up, hey, this person's getting out, so they can be aware.
The new format you're using, can that help somebody also obtain the restraining order later on down the road? With all the survey questions that you have?
They don't necessarily get a copy of the survey. We don't get it, but if we register them with the domestic violence hotline, they might be able to get that information from them. If there's a report written and then the victim, they can get, that would be included in the copy of the report. So there's potential, I'm not sure of the information how exactly how it goes, but it could help. And they could also, show, they go to our headquarters and ask for, can you tell me how many times you've been in my house? They can show a paper trail of how many times we've been there and what we've been there for.
So I guess encouraging them to do as much information.
Yes. Yes, I agree. And you know, like I said, it's new. You know, it could come out with a revamped form next year with different questions. But you know, if I feel that they need to be they didn't screen in, I feel they need to, then I can just overrule the question. I just have a feeling, you know. Yes. Yeah.
I think what I'm going to ask, if I can, is that meeting program, and that's going to stay to the end, so if you have any additional questions, you guys can at that time. Okay.
Appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matt. Really appreciate that. And I appreciate all the questions as well. Okay, now we have Justin Smith, who is a member of our Killingworth Lions. And if you have noticed a bunch of dashing men with blue blazers and striped ties and white shirts here, our leading men's organization in town has joined us here in a stand of solidarity on this issue of domestic violence, and we really appreciate it, guys. Justin Smith is a member of Killingworth Lions and an attorney, and he will address the group as a representative of the Lions and also in support of this matter, but also shed some light on the legal issues. So some of the questions that you had for Matt may get addressed with Justin. Justin, thanks for being here.
Good evening. My name is Justin Smith, and I'm the first vice president of the Killingworth Lions Club. I'm happy to report is no longer just a men's organization. This past year we accepted our first female members, and we hope to extend that outreach to anyone who may be interested in becoming a Lion. Certainly please speak with us about that process. I want to thank the Killingworth Women's Organization for inviting the Lions. It's a very important event. We're here to provide support and solidarity with their group, and going forward to help educate the community in any way we can regarding this important topic. As they said, I am an attorney. My office is in New Haven. I practice primarily in the areas of criminal defense and personal injury. In the course of my practice, I have represented both persons accused of domestic violence and victims of domestic violence in the court system. And I'd like to discuss some of the legal options that are available to victims of domestic violence in the court system. Domestic violence cases generally reach the court system in two ways, either through the criminal process, meaning there's been an arrest, or through the civil process, and I'll talk briefly about both of those. So in the criminal process, of course, it starts with an arrest. And as Matt had mentioned, the first time that someone is in court, in addition to any temporary order that is issued on behalf of the arresting officers to protect the victim, the first time in court, the court will also set a protective order. And that protective order will be set with the victim's input if the victim appears or at least has some contact with the court to inform them of their position. And that's usually done through the victim's advocate, so that the victim themselves does not have to come into the court and face the abuser. The victim's advocate will pass along the information to the court and will, as the name states, advocate for that victim. Now, when, the first time that a abuser is arrested or someone accused of domestic violence is arrested, if that is the first arrest, even though it may not have been the first incident of violence, the person can be screened by the Family Relations Office within the courthouse to determine if they might be suitable for a diversionary program called the Domestic Violence Program. The Family Violence Education Program. What that program does is, if the person who is accused of the abuse agrees to go through treatment, counseling, and/or classes, and the case is sort of put off for a period of time for the resolution, generally a year. If the person completes that counseling and education, then and they've complied with any other requirements of the court, including no further incidents with the victim, then the charges will be dismissed if they've satisfactorily completed that program. But when that person comes in, that protective order is still there. Those protective orders can range everywhere from complete no contact to all the way down to what they call a no threats, violence, or harassment order. A complete no contact means just that. Absolutely zero contact. Direct, indirect, through a third party, email, text, phone, it doesn't matter. Any contact initiated by the abuser to the victim is a violation of the court's protective order. There's also what they call a residential stay away that allows the abuser and victim to have contact. If it's a minor, more of a lesser incident, and they think they can work it out, they have kids in common, that's a more common type of protective order. They can have contact, discuss things with the kids. The abuser may be able to see the kids if the victim wishes, but they can't go back to the house. And of course, the third one is really the lowest level. It doesn't provide a great deal of protection because any threats, violence, or harassment are criminal in nature anyway. So if that were to occur, it's a new crime, but it would also be a violation of the court's order, which is also a crime. The thing to understand about protective orders in the criminal system is that, for the most part, they are temporary. They only last as long as the case is pending before the court. Once the case is over, whether that's through a dismissal, a guilty plea, or a conviction after trial, once that is over, the protective order is gone, at least for that purposes of the criminal case. However, if the case is sufficiently serious, meaning grave bodily harm to the victim, or serious threat of violence with a weapon, or a long-standing demonstrated pattern of abuse, there is what's called a standing criminal protective order that is available. And that's a more recent addition to the laws in Connecticut. That standing criminal protective order is indefinite, meaning it can stand forever, for the lifetime of the victim. But again, it's not employed very often because it takes more of an extreme showing in order to get it put into place. However, if there is a period of probation following a conviction for an abuser, let's say their end result of their case is they are convicted of something, a condition of probation can be that once they're served any jail time that they have, and if they're on probation, a condition of the probation is that they cannot have contact with the victim. So during the period of probation, which can last for several years after the conviction or after the final time that the person gets out of jail, there is still some protection there. If they do have contact with the victim, then that is a violation of probation, which is a new criminal charge that can be brought against the person. They could be returned to court to face time in jail for the violation of probation. Moving over to the civil side of the process, there's no arrest needed in that scenario. And this may be the person who is trying to get out, but there's no arrest made. So a victim can go to the court, and obviously, I would encourage doing that with some help, so you have some support. And again, the victim's advocate may be able to assist, as the woman from New Horizons had told us. That might, they may be able to help in some situations with that, or a friend or family member can go with you. And the way that works is when you go to the court, you fill out some paperwork asking for that restraining order. You can also fill out a section that asks for an ex parte order. And what that means, in English is the other party isn't aware at all that this is going on. They don't have to be notified, and they won't be notified. And the victim fills out an affidavit stating why they're in fear of the abuser, and once they do that, a court will look at that affidavit, and they will issue an order, a restraining order, then at that point the abuser is served by a marshal who will actually bring the papers to that person and say you are not to have any contact with this person at least until a hearing can be held, and that hearing is held within generally 14 days of the original application. If at the hearing the judge is convinced that the allegations are credible, then the judge can issue a restraining order for up to 1 year. That restraining order will remain in effect during that time, and it can be renewed by motion to the court before that 1 year is up if the circumstances still warrant the need for that restraining order. And those orders are available to people who are immediate family members of an abuser, if they live in the home with the abuser, or if they're currently dating or previously dating the abuser. So if there's an ex-boyfriend who's still creating issues for the victim, they still have recourse to the court for that. Also in the civil side, there is a proceeding through divorce proceedings if those happen to be taking place, and which sometimes those are parallel to any criminal process or other things because the person is finally trying to make the break. A person can apply to the family court who's handling the divorce also in an ex parte manner, meaning we don't have to consult the other party, and it's a similar process where an affidavit is filled out and presented to the court saying, I need immediate emergency custody of the children, because if I don't, they're in danger or they're going to use the children to get to me. And the court can order that as part of that process. There are other laws in Connecticut that help protect domestic violence victims. There's an address confidentiality program. That means that when those civil processes or criminal processes are in place, if the victim is moved to a new address away from the abuser, that address is not shared with the abuser. It is protected and redacted from any documents that they might have access to. They also have employment protections, meaning if you needed for some reason to take some leave, which would probably be common if you're trying to leave the abuser, that your job is protected, because that is a concern for many domestic violence victims. If I leave, I have to leave my job, I'm going to lose my financial support, but there are protections that allow you some leave time in order to deal with domestic violence. There's also protections that would allow you out of leases. If you're in a lease with a partner, a domestic violence situation, the abuser, and you have a lease and you're afraid, well, if I break the lease, they're going to come after me, you can get out of that lease if you're the victim of domestic violence. There are also emergency assistance funds and resources for kids too. But most of these are the types of things that you would explore either through someone like from New Horizons or through the victim's advocate at the court. The last part I will talk about, and I think this will address this young lady's question about the effectiveness of protective orders. Some people say it's just a piece of paper. That's true. But it's a piece of paper that has the full force and effect of law, but that's only effective if it's enforced, and it's only enforced if the police are aware of it. And so this is not statistical in any way. It's simply anecdotal from my own practice and having observed these cases over the years. Most violations of protective orders and restraining orders, the first time it happens, it's not a violent event necessarily. It's the abuser testing with the victim. Can I get away with this? A text, a phone call, come by the house, maybe run into them in public accidentally, and see how they react. Much like the woman in the video said, the first time the violence happens, we've got to see how they're going to react. If that person, the victim, does not, even if it's a seemingly innocent contact, if they do not call law enforcement, then the abuser sort of gets the signal they're not going to enforce that order. And then they start to move their way back into the person's life until that pattern repeats again. So if the protective order is in place, whether it's criminal or restraining order on the civil side, the victim, and if you're trying to help somebody, it's important to encourage them. You have to call. No matter how innocent the contact is, if you don't call, the message is they can come back anytime they want. And finally, I can address that other question about prosecution without the consent of the victim. The short answer is yes. Under Connecticut's Constitution, victims have certain rights, rights to be informed about the process and the case, a right to have their input known about the case, but they do not have a veto power over the case. It's a common misconception that if the victim doesn't, quote unquote, press charges, then the prosecutor cannot go forward. No, the prosecutor can go forward, but then it just becomes an issue of level of and quality of the proof that they would have. If a victim is uncooperative and they are the main source of the evidence against the abuser through their testimony, and they refuse to cooperate, that does make the job of the prosecutor much more difficult in that prosecution. But sometimes there is enough evidence to go forward with the prosecution, even in cases where the victim doesn't want prosecution. And it's not uncommon that I have seen prosecutions go forward even when the victim asks that they don't. But I think that's probably the safer, obviously the safer course for the courts to go. Yeah, I can take a couple of questions. I know we're running a little over time that we were expecting, so if anyone has any, I'm happy to answer that, and I'll also stay afterwards if anyone has any additional. Yes?
State marshal service is expensive. What would we tell someone we're giving advice to or trying to help if they in fact don't have any money?
Well, I can also say that pretty much all of these processes do not depend on having money. There are court fees that apply to some of these things, but you can also, the courts do not deny people who are indigent. So you may have to fill out, in addition to the paperwork that you're asking for at the courthouse, say for a restraining order, you can also fill out what's called an affidavit of indigency that just says, I simply don't make enough money to pay for any of this. And the courts have funds to cover that. Yes? Every situation is different, but it's not uncommon. I'm sure Trooper Ward would tell you that sometimes the 911 call comes from the children. They just want their parents to stop, fighting, or dad to stop hitting mom, or whatever the situation is. So, obviously, if the child is old enough to be verbal and make a phone call, generally they're old enough that what they say would be usually held to be credible by the police and be usable as evidence by the prosecution. Okay? Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much, Justin. All right, we're coming into the home stretch, everybody. Obviously, if domestic violence case gets to the court level, serious outcomes may be in store for those who are involved. Some may get justice, some may get due penalties. But one thing that we haven't talked a lot about, and we're going to have a very brief video to discuss this, is how do you prevent domestic violence from ever happening? How do you help get those seeds that get planted and turn them into another direction? Our next presentation is another TED Talk presentation. It's a brief video. Here, Jackson Katz provides a thought-provoking perspective about how all of us, as bystanders, can be part of the solution by playing an active role in preventing it in the first place.
I'm going to share with you a paradigm-shifting perspective on the issues of gender violence, sexual assault, domestic violence, relationship abuse, sexual harassment, sexual abuse of children, that whole range of issues that I'll refer to in shorthand as gender violence issues. They've been seen as women's issues that some good men help out with. But I have a problem with that frame, and I don't accept it. I don't see these as women's issues that some good men help out with. In fact, I'm going to argue that these are men's issues, first and foremost. Now, obviously, Obviously, there are also women's issues, so I appreciate that. But calling gender violence a women's issue is part of the problem for a number of reasons. The first is that it gives men an excuse not to pay attention, right? A lot of men hear the term women's issues and we tend to tune it out and we think, hey, I'm a guy, that's for the girls or that's for the women. And a lot of men literally don't get beyond the first sentence as a result. It's almost like a chip in our brain is activated and the neural pathways take our attention in a different direction when we hear the term women's issues. This is also true, by the way, of the word gender, because a lot of people hear the word gender and they think it means women. So they think that gender issues is synonymous with women's issues. There's some confusion about the term gender. And actually, let me illustrate that confusion by way of analogy. So let's talk for a moment about race. In the US, when we hear the word race, a lot of people think that means African American, Latino, Asian American, Native American, South Asian, Pacific Islander, on and on. A lot of people, when they hear the word sexual orientation, think it means gay, lesbian, bisexual. And a lot of people, when they hear the word gender, think it means women. In each case, the dominant group doesn't get paid attention to, right? As if white people don't have some sort of racial identity or belong to some racial category or construct. As if heterosexual people don't have a sexual orientation. As if men don't have a gender. This is one of the ways that dominant systems maintain and reproduce themselves, which is to say the dominant group is rarely challenged to even think about its dominance, because that's one of the key characteristics of power and privilege, the ability to go unexamined, lacking introspection, and in fact being rendered invisible in large measure in the discourse about issues that are primarily about us. And this is amazing how this works in domestic and sexual violence, how men have been largely erased from so much of the conversation about a subject that is centrally about men. And I'm going to illustrate what I'm talking about by using the old tech. I'm old school on some fundamental regards. I make films and I work with, high tech, but I'm still old school as an educator. And I want to share with you this exercise that illustrates on the sentence structure level how the way that we think, literally the way that we use language, conspires to keep our attention off of men. This is about domestic violence in particular, but you can plug in other analogs. This comes from the work of the feminist linguist Julia Penelope. It starts with a very basic English sentence. John beat Mary. That's a good English sentence. John is the subject, beat is the verb, Mary is the object. Good sentence. Now we're going to move to the second sentence, which says the same thing in the passive voice. Mary was beaten by John. And now a whole lot has happened in one sentence. We've gone from John beat Mary to Mary was beaten by John. We've shifted our focus in one sentence from John to Mary. And you can see John is very close to the end of the sentence, well, close to dropping off the map of our psychic plane. The third sentence, John is dropped, and we have Mary was beaten, and now it's all about Mary. We're not even thinking about John, it's totally focused on Mary. Over the past generation, the term we've used synonymous with beaten is battered, so we have Mary was battered. And the final sentence in this sequence, flowing from the others, is Mary is a battered woman. So now Mary's very identity, Mary is a battered woman, is what was done to her by John in the first instance. But we've demonstrated that John has long ago left the conversation. Now, those of us who work in domestic and sexual violence field know that victim blaming is pervasive in this realm, which is to say blaming the person to whom something was done rather than the person who did it. And we say things like, why do these women go out with these men? Why are they attracted to these men? Why do they keep going back? What was she wearing at that party? What a stupid thing to do. Why was she drinking with that group of guys in that hotel room? This is victim blaming. And there are numerous reasons for it, but one of them is that our whole cognitive structure is set up to blame victims. This is all unconscious. Our whole cognitive structure is set up to ask questions about women and women's choices and what they're doing, thinking, and wearing. And I'm not going to shout down people who ask questions about women. Okay, it's a legitimate thing to ask. But let's be clear, asking questions about Mary is not going to get us anywhere in terms of preventing violence. We have to ask a different set of questions. And you can see where I'm going with this, right? The questions are not about Mary, they're about John. The questions include things like, why does John beat Mary? Why is domestic violence still a big problem in the United States and all over the world? What's going on? Why do so many men abuse physically, emotionally, and verbally and other ways the women and girls and the men and boys that they claim to love? What's going on with men? Why do so many adult men sexually abuse little girls and little boys? Why is that a common problem in our society and all over the world today? Why? Why do we hear over and over again about new scandals erupting in major institutions like the Catholic Church or the Penn State football program or the Boy Scouts of America, on and on and on, and then local communities all over the country and all the world, right? We hear about it all the time. Sexual abuse of children. What's going on with men? Why do so many men rape women in our society and around the world? Why do so many men rape other men? What is going on with men? And then what is the role of the various institutions in our society that are helping to produce abusive men at pandemic rates? Because this isn't about individual perpetrators. That's a naive way to understanding what is a much deeper and more systematic social problem. You know, the perpetrators aren't these, monsters who crawl out of the swamp and come into town and do their nasty business and then retreat into the darkness. That's a very naive notion, right? Perpetrators are much more normal than that and everyday than that. So the question is, what are we doing here in our society and in the world? What are the roles of the various institutions in helping to produce abusive men? What's the role of religious belief systems, the sports culture, the pornography culture, the family structure, economics and how that intersects, and race and ethnicity and how that intersects? How does all this work? And then once we start making those kind of connections and asking those important and big questions, then we can talk about how can we be transformative? In other words, how can we do something differently? How can we change the practices? How can we change the socialization of boys and the definitions of manhood that lead to these current outcomes? These are the kind of questions that we need to be asking and the kind of work that we need to be doing, but if we're endlessly focused on what women are doing and thinking in relationships or elsewhere, we're not going to get to that piece. Now, I understand that a lot of women who have been trying to speak out about these issues today and yesterday and for years and years often get shouted down for their efforts. They get called nasty names like male basher and man hater and the disgusting and offensive feminazi, right? And you know what all this is about? It's called kill the messenger. It's because the women who are standing up and speaking out for themselves and for other women, as well as for men and boys, it's a statement to them to sit down and shut up. Keep the current system in place because we don't like it when people rock the boat. We don't like it when people challenge our power. You better sit down and shut up, basically. And thank goodness that women haven't done that. Thank goodness that we live in a world where there's so much women's leadership that can counteract that. But one of the powerful roles that men can play in this work is that we can say some things that sometimes women can't say, or better yet, we can be heard saying some things that women often can't be heard saying. Now, I appreciate that's a problem, it's sexism, but it's the truth. And so one of the things that I say to men, and my colleagues and I always say this, is we need more men who have the courage and the strength to start standing up and saying some of this stuff. And standing with women, not against them, pretending that somehow this is a battle between the sexes and other kinds of nonsense. We live in the world together. And by the way, one of the things that really bothers me about some of the rhetoric that against feminists and others who have built the battered women's and rape crisis movements around the world is that somehow, like I said, that they're anti-male. What about all the boys who are profoundly affected in a negative way by what some adult man is doing against their mother, themselves, their sisters? What about all those boys? What about all the young men and boys who have been traumatized by adult men's violence? You know what? The same system that produces men who abuse women produces men who abuse other men. And if we want to talk about male victims, let's talk about male victims. Most male victims of violence are the victims of other men's violence. So that's something that both women and men have in common. We are both victims of men's violence. So we have it in our direct self-interest, not to mention the fact that most men that I know have women and girls that we care deeply about in our families, in our friendship circles, and every other way. So there's so many reasons why we need men to speak out. It seems obvious saying it out loud, doesn't it? Now, the nature of the work that I do and my colleagues do in the sports culture, in the US military, in schools, we pioneered this approach called the bystander approach to gender violence prevention. And I just want to give you the highlights of the bystander approach because it's a big sort of thematic shift, although there's lots of particulars. But the heart of it is, instead of seeing men as perpetrators, women as victims, or women as perpetrators, men as victims, or any combination in there, I'm using the gender binary. I know there's more than men and women. There's more than male and female. And there are women who are perpetrators, and of course there are men who are victims. There's a whole spectrum. But instead of seeing it in the binary fashion, we focus on all of us as what we call bystanders. And a bystander is defined as anybody who is not a perpetrator or a victim in a given situation. So in other words, friends, teammates, colleagues, co-workers, family members, those of us who are not directly involved in a dyad of abuse, but we are embedded in social, family, work, school, and other peer culture relationships with people who might be in that situation. What do we do? How do we speak up? How do we challenge our friends? How do we support our friends? But how do we not remain silent in the face of abuse? Now, when it comes to men and male culture, the goal is to get men who are not abusive to challenge men who are. And when I say abusive, I don't mean just men who are beating women. We're not just saying that a man whose friend is abusing his girlfriend needs to stop the guy at the moment of attack. I mean, that's a naive way of creating a social change. It's along a continuum we're trying to get men to interrupt each other. So, for example, if you're a guy and you're in a group of guys playing poker, talking, hanging out, no women present, and another guy says something sexist or degrading or harassing about women, instead of laughing along or pretending you didn't hear it, we need men to say, hey, that's not funny. That could be my sister you're talking about, and could you joke about something else? Or could you talk about something else? I don't appreciate that kind of talk. Just like if you're a white person and another white person makes a racist comment, I hope, that white people would interrupt that racist enactment by a fellow white person. Just like with heterosexism, if you're a heterosexual person and you yourself don't enact harassing or abusive behaviors towards people of varying sexual orientations, if you don't say something in the face of other heterosexual people doing that, then in a sense, isn't your silence a form of consent and complicity? Well, the bystander approach is trying to give people tools to interrupt that process and to speak up and to create a peer culture climate where the abusive behavior will be seen as unacceptable, not just because it's illegal, but because it's wrong and unacceptable in the peer culture. And if we can get to the place where men who act out in sexist ways will lose status, young men and boys who act out in sexist and harassing ways towards girls and women, as well as towards other boys and men, will lose status as a result of it, guess what? We'll see a radical diminution of the abuse, because the typical perpetrator is not sick and twisted. He's a normal guy in every other way, isn't he? Now, among the many great things that Martin Luther King said in his short life was, in the end, what'll hurt the most is not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. In the end, what'll hurt the most is not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. There's been an awful lot of silence in male culture about this ongoing tragedy of men's violence against women and children, hasn't there? There's been an awful lot of silence. And all I'm saying is that we need to break that silence, and we need more men to do that. Now, it's easier said than done, because I'm saying it now, but I'm telling you, it's not easy in male culture for guys to challenge each other, which is one of the reasons why part of the paradigm shift that has to happen is not just understanding these issues as men's issues, but they're also leadership issues for men. Because ultimately, the responsibility for taking a stand on these issues should not fall on the shoulder of little boys or teenage boys in high school or college men. It should be on adult men with power. Adult men with power are the ones we need to be holding accountable for being leaders on these issues. Because when somebody speaks up in a peer culture and challenges and interrupts, he or she is being a leader, really, right? But on a big scale, we need more adult men with power to start prioritizing these issues. And we haven't seen that yet, have we? Now, I was at a dinner a number of years ago, and I work extensively with the U.S. military, all the services. And I was at this dinner, and this woman said to me, I think she thought she was a little clever, she said, so how long have you been doing sensitivity training with the Marines? And I said, with all due respect, I don't do sensitivity training with the Marines. I run a leadership program in the Marine Corps. Now, I know it's a bit pompous, my response, but it's an important distinction, because I don't believe that what we need is sensitivity training. We need leadership training. Because, for example, when a professional coach or manager of a baseball team or a football team, and I work extensively in that realm as well, makes a sexist comment, makes a homophobic statement, makes a racist comment, there'll be discussions on the sports blogs and in sports talk radio, and some people will say, well, he needs sensitivity training, and other people will say, well, get off it, that's political correctness, run amok, and he made a stupid statement, move on. My argument is he doesn't need sensitivity training, he needs leadership training, because he's being a bad leader. Because in a society with gender diversity and sexual diversity and racial and ethnic diversity, you make those kind of comments, you're failing at your leadership. If we can make this point that I'm making to powerful men and women in our society at all levels of institutional authority and power, it's going to change. It's going to change the paradigm of people's thinking. For example, I work a lot in college and university athletics throughout North America, right? We know so much about how to prevent domestic and sexual violence, right? there's no excuse for a college or university to not have domestic and sexual violence prevention training mandated for all student athletes, coaches, and administrators as part of their educational process. We know enough to know that we can easily do that, but you know what's missing? The leadership. But it's not the leadership of student athletes. It's the leadership of the athletic director, the president of the university, the people in charge who make decisions about resources and who make decisions about priorities in the institutional settings, right? That's a failure, in most cases, of men's leadership. Look at Penn State. Penn State is the mother of all teachable moments for the bystander approach. You had so many situations in that realm where men in powerful positions failed to act to protect children, in this case, boys. It's unbelievable, really. But when you get into it, you realize there are pressures on men. There are constraints within peer cultures on men, which is why we need to encourage men to break through those pressures. And one of the ways to do that is to say there's an awful lot of men who care deeply about these issues. I know this. I work with men, and I've been working with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men for many, many decades now. It's scary when you think about it, how many years. But there's so many men who care deeply about these issues, but caring deeply is not enough. We need more men with the guts, with the courage, with the strength, with the moral integrity to break our complicit silence and challenge each other and stand with women, not against them. By the way, we owe it to women, there's no question about it, but we also owe it to our sons. We also owe it to young men who are growing up all over the world in situations where they didn't make the choice to be a man in a culture that tells them that manhood is a certain way. They didn't make the choice. We that have a choice have an opportunity and a responsibility to them as well. I hope that going forward, men and women working together can begin the change and the transformation that will happen so that future generations won't have the level of tragedy that we deal with on a daily basis. I know we can do it. We can do better. Thank you very much.
We're very lucky to have our state senator, Ted Kennedy Jr. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
This is the important mic.
All right, thank you. I just have a few minutes. By the way, I've been sitting here in the back of the room listening to the speakers, and this has been really helpful to me to learn more about what really happens in domestic violence situations. And I'm attending a roundtable tomorrow in Guilford. So I think that these are issues that impact every single community around our state. And my job is to listen and find out what's going on as your newly elected representative in Hartford. And I'm learning that, you know, it's not, domestic violence is not just somebody who's verbally or physically abusive. It's also somebody that is really trying to control another person within their house. We heard the resident state trooper say, you know, people's phones are frequently looked at, and people are tracking with whom somebody else is talking to. And in my view, it's any circumstance where somebody is trying to exert power and control over another person. And it's a pattern of behavior. I'm also I'm really thrilled that the Killingworth Women's Organization, the Lions here in town, are stepping up to make this a major priority, to really tell everyone in this region that you're not alone, that there's no excuse for abuse, and that no one deserves to be treated like this. So I have a couple of handouts which are in the back. One is a news release from the Connecticut Academy of Science and Engineering that they just completed just this past September 21st, which is a family violence study. That was commissioned by the Public Health Committee in addition to chairing the Environment Committee for the State Senate. I also serve on the Public Health Committee. And what they're finding is what the idea here is to try to understand better, you know, the causes of domestic violence, the standards by which we should intervene in these circumstances, many of the same questions that we've heard here tonight, that it's not always a one-size-fits-all intervention. The training for online first-line people that confront this situation, the the fact that a lot of these issues it's hard to disentangle from substance abuse and psychiatric conditions within the home. And so this study is, and you can also look up and get a more detailed, this is just the press release, but it's a synopsis of what the study says. Another handout I have is just the laws that we passed this last term. We just adjourned last June. We're going to go back in February, but there was a law that created a 16-member domestic violence offender program advisory council. It also looks at changes in rules regarding the Superior Court, family intervention unit's role in providing victim and offender treatment services. One of the very controversial issues, and actually I'd be hearing not now as they get the film rolling and we'll watch it, but I'll be here as well. One of the more controversial issues that we faced as a legislature is the issue of removing weapons from the home in a temporary restraining order situation. We know that somebody is arrested, accused of domestic violence. The woman, it's mostly women, the woman is afraid of her life, and if there are weapons in the home, there have been circumstances nationwide where the anger is flared, and before anybody can do anything about it, those weapons are used to kill or injure the victim. And many people feel that just in issuing a temporary restraining order, that's not really a due process, a process by which somebody should have to give up their weapons. And so this is a very controversial issue. I'd be interested actually in hearing the feedback from people in this room, how they feel about that, because I can understand both sides. And I'd be interested also in the comments by others who are here who face those types of situations. So again, I thank the Killingworth Women's Organization for holding this forum, for inviting me here. My door is always open to speak with you on this or any other topic. I consider it an honor to represent Killingworth in the state legislature, and I hope that you'll call on me if there's anything I can ever do on your behalf. Thank you so much.
So to conclude, Killingworth Aware, a program on domestic violence awareness, we will leave you with 2 rhetorical questions. What are you aware of as a result of the program tonight, and what will you do about it? We've heard from a survivor, an advocate, an enforcer, a civic organization leader and lawyer, and a state representative, all with the same message. Let's shed light on the issue of domestic violence. Let's be sensitive to the signs and the signals and understand the lessons learned and the do's and don'ts and the misconceptions. Let's share information about the resources that are available. And lastly, let's be sure that all interactions that we are party in are civil and respectful to all genders. Thank you all for being here tonight. You've been such an attentive audience. Please complete our survey program survey. And if you'd like to linger and discuss what you've heard tonight, ask additional questions, please feel free to do so. And on behalf of the Killingworth Women's Organization and all of our supporters, I bid you good night.